Good morning, Night City! Yesterday's body count lottery rounded out to a solid and sturdy 30. 10 out of Haywood, thanks to unabated gang wars. One officer down, so I guess you're all screwed, cause the NCPD will not let that go. Got another blackout in Santo Domingo. Netrunners are at it again, poking holes in the power grid. While over in Westbrook, trauma teams scraping cyber psycho victims off the pavement. And in Pacifica, well, Pacifica is still Pacifica. This has been your man, Stan. Join me for another day in our City of Dreams.
What's up, guys? How's everyone doing? Welcome back to Darth Matu's Holocron. Today, we're going to talk yet more lore. We are going to explore the world of Cyberpunk, probably made most famous by CDProjeckt Red's video game Cyberpunk 2077. But Cyberpunk is far more than just that one video game, encompassing several tabletop supplements, at least one lore book meant to ease people into the game world. The timeline is rich, detailed, and covers about a century's worth of space in the near future. It really is a world that I have fallen in love with, and I'm going to break down the general history for you guys today. We'll get more into specifics in future videos, explore the corporate wars, the collapse, other big events within the universe, but for today, we are getting general, going from the beginning to the end, giving you guys an overview of the storyline. The first thing that you gotta realize is that Cyberpunk takes place in a world that is similar to our own. In fact, it was essentially identical until about the year 1989. That is where the first real divergence begins. A group known as the Gang of Four, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and the DEA, unified together into a secretive cabal that moved to seize power from the US government behind the scenes, and succeeded. Now, some of you might immediately think of the idea of the deep state and some more modern conspiracy theories. Cyberpunk assumes that these types of things are true, and by the time that 1990 rolled around, the Gang of Four controlled the US with an iron fist, even though most regular citizens had no idea. Things on the surface rolled forward as they always had, but the Gang of Four was busy with their own agenda. They launched a war in South America in a bid to restore fading American imperialism across the globe, and this kicked off what became known as the First Central American Conflict, justified to the American public as necessary to stop the spread of communism and to end the war on drugs once and for all. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe was getting its act together. The Soviet Union broke down and opened channels to Western Europe, growing closer to their old enemies as the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunified. The European Economic Community was officially established in 1992, and this is an organization that's very similar to the real-life European Union, but they have a lot more authority. The countries of Europe combined their economies, and essentially used its new unity to rise into the position of a world superpower, supplanting the US. They established what became known as the Eurodollar, Cyberpunk's version of the euro, and the Eddy, as it would come to be colloquially known, quickly came to compete with the US dollar on the international stage. The Gang of Four would launch into something known as the Quiet War in response to this, engaging in a clandestine series of attacks against the EEC, each one designed to undermine their new unity and undermine the value of the Eurodollar. At the same time, there was some other stuff going on back in the US. The Knight Corporation was founded by Richard and Miriam Knight, two wealthy business people who held to a dream of a utopian city of the future. Richard was the most passionate of the pair, and he pursued his dream with abandon, hoping to gain the resources needed to build his Coronado city. Official plans would begin to be drawn up as Knight courted investors, but construction wouldn't finally begin until 1993. Things in the US outside of that were far from stable. The wars overseas were beginning to take a very serious toll, with Colombian drug lords responding to the first South American conflict by detonating a small nuclear device in New York City during the year 1993. 15,000 people were killed, and the city was devastated. On top of this, environmental devastation was beginning to become evident, with the Midwest experiencing year after year of drought. The Gang of Four had been competing economically with the EEC, as well as following their wars of imperialism, and it had stretched their resources thin. They hacked into the servers of the EEC and ramped up their efforts to artificially hold back the eurodollar. This was an extremely short-sighted strategy, however, and when this information was found out by the EEC, they just released it to the world. And the resulting panic resulted in the market crash of 1994. Confidence in international currencies evaporated, and the economy of the world utterly collapsed. The world would also slap the US with sanctions in response, essentially cutting the country off from the international community as a whole, and making things much worse within its borders. Shortages became common, and many people began to leave their homes. They took to the road out of necessity, looking for resources or sanctuary from the rising political upheaval. These groups became known as the first nomads, eventually growing to include hundreds of people, moving towns that could slowly turn into unified clans, bound together by kinship. Growing internal problems forced the US to end the first South American conflict in 1994. The same year, construction on Coronado City had proceeded to the point where it could officially be founded. Richard Knight began calling people to his new utopia. Crime rates, they started to take off across the country, with authorities becoming less and less able to deal with the overwhelming issues in the country. The Bloods, a famous street gang, even in real life, managed to seize control of the entire state of Florida by the year 1995, and much of the rest of the country began to suffer under riots, civil unrest, homelessness. Things finally reached a head in 1996. The US was almost completely out of money, inflation out of control as the Gang of Four's economic manipulations were laid bare. The World Stock Exchange and the World Bank were just gone, evaporated in the Great Collapse. The US was also still suffering under sanctions from the international community. There was just no one left to borrow money from. The military was deployed in August of 1996, and martial law was declared across the country. The Constitution suspended. Both the president and the vice president were killed in joint assassinations, and the line of succession was disrupted by both corporate interference and pressure from the Gang of Four. The US fell completely into their hands, and then it fell completely to pieces. Many of the states reacted to this situation with secession, refusing to live under a government that was no longer their own. They essentially became their own nations again, with their own laws and currencies, becoming known as the Free States. Northern and Southern California would separate and become their own states, followed by Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, and more. Pretty much everything west of the Mississippi. The United States, as it had been, ceased to exist. Things were a little better elsewhere in the world. Economic collapse had affected everyone, even the EEC. There was a brief brushfire war in the Middle East in the year of 1997, but it turned nuclear, and the entire region became a radioactive wasteland, cutting the world off from its chief oil supply. Thankfully, Biotechnica stood ready to answer this problem, having developed a synthetic fuel back in 1992 that was known as CHO2. Now, the chemical formula, I guess, for this is CHOOH2, which is why it got the name CHO2. CHO2 was a methanol-based alcohol that was able to run engines in place of gasoline, so the world moved en masse to the use of it. switching cars from oil to methanol, and making biotechnica obscenely rich in the process. The EEC was the area with the most stability, and their space agency in particular made gains during this time. They managed to set up a colony on the moon, known as Tycho Colony, and they began building a mass driver there, a weapon capable of accelerating rocks to a percentage of the speed of light. Now, ostensibly, this was supposed to be used for transportation, but we all know that they meant to use it as a weapon. The old Soviet Union finally finished breaking apart, but they reformed into the Union of Sovereign Soviet Republics, closing the gap between itself and Europe, calling themselves the Neo-Soviets. Hong Kong was returned to China by Britain, but the Chinese languished in the grip of a civil war. Formal investigations into the Gang of Four began back in the US and on the international stage, but they proved extremely difficult to overcome. Drought continued to ravage the Midwest, turning America's breadbasket into little more than parched, dusty grassland. An enormous 10.5 earthquake occurred in 1998, absolutely devastating Los Angeles. 65,000 people died during this catastrophe, and much of the city actually sank into the sea. People began to turn to any answer in their desperation, and by 1999, the US and other areas of the world had seen a rise in so-called millennium cults, groups that predicted the end of the world on January 1st, 2000. These cults grew more and more ingrained and radical, playing on people's fears and insecurities in a time of turmoil. Finally, these cults would explode, wreaking havoc across the US when New Year's of the year 2000 arrived, committing suicide, attacking others, and disrupting society still further. Most of these cults would destroy themselves during this period, but a few of them managed to survive. Tycho Colony was completed by the end of 1999, and the Gang of Four saw this as a serious threat to their power. The EEC looked to capitalize on their success by starting construction on the Crystal Palace, an enormous space station at the L1 Lagrange point in high Earth orbit. The US intelligence agencies began looking for a way to sabotage the EEC's efforts in space. Diseases started springing up around the world at the same time. The Gang of Four had released them, designer diseases that they had used during the first South American conflict, so perhaps it's not a surprise that they got out of control. A terrible plague would start spreading through Europe and the US in the year 2000, killing millions. It was known as the Wasting Plague, and it attacked the intestines of those who were afflicted, causing them to starve to death no matter how much food they ate. The Gang of Four did absolutely nothing to stop the spread of this disease, instead refusing to even acknowledge its existence. They downplayed its severity, and it ran wild among the populace. The Wasting Plague only began to die back when Japan developed a vaccine and started distributing it across the world. The Gang of Four, in fact, had almost completely given up the ghost of true governance and were focused almost exclusively on fighting for American hegemony abroad. They took increasingly desperate measures in order to maintain control of what little they had left. 2002 was the year of the food crash, when strange, mutated plant viruses burned through Canada and the Neo-Soviet Union. US agribusiness managed to survive by developing a biological counteragent, and the Neo-Soviets accused the US of resorting to biological warfare. The world's opinion of America sank still further, and things would come to a head the following year, 2003, when the Gang of Four launched a desperate war in South America in an attempt to reclaim their lost power and prestige. This war was known as the Second South American Conflict, and it was an absolute disaster. The US military was unable to make gains. Thousands were killed, and finally the Gang of Four gave up the ghost, abandoning the effort and leaving thousands of soldiers behind to find their way home. Many of these people were nomads, and their journey home became known as the Long Walk. Less than 10% of them would make it back to the US. a journalist by the name of Tesla Johansson? I'm so bad at names, but I'm pretty sure it's Johannesson. Exposed NSA transcripts, revealing that the Gang of Four's involvement in the first South American conflict was purposeful and well planned. The world did not react well, with a storm of protests being kicked off, riots in what remained of the United States. The Gang of Four was finally broken, swept away in a wave of reform that helped to restore civilian government. Not everything was roses, however, and much of this progress only came with the backing of the megacorporations, which gave them even more of a foothold in the world government. Corporations, in fact, had been making gains across the globe this entire time, taking advantage of the tumultuous period to increase their power and holdings. They had wormed their way into the governments of the world, and many of them commanded private security forces that classified as militaries of their own. Companies began to exercise their new power by competing against one another with increasing viciousness. IBM and Orbital Air, two global companies, would take their competition to the next level in the year 2004, actually engaging in open warfare. They attacked each other with commando raids in real space, but also across the burgeoning net, which had been put into place in 2001. This conflict would be known as the First Corporate War, and it would burn from 2004 until 2006. Meanwhile, as the world continued to spiral, Coronado City flourished. It started out as a clean, modern metropolis, shining in Northern California. Richard Knight himself was killed by the mob in 1998, and the city was renamed Night City by the city council in his honor. The mob had really wanted into Night City since the very beginning. They had a large stake in the construction industry, but Richard Knight stood in their way. With him gone, there was nothing stopping the crime lords from moving in. Knight's company would have to reorganize, with Miriam at the helm, eventually morphing into Night Corp, Night City's homegrown corporation. Despite this, though, the city was completely dominated by the mob by the year 2005, crime shooting to endemic levels. The corporations that had invested in Night City couldn't be bothered to run it, and as such, anarchy and violence became the rule. The widespread use of cybernetics only added to the chaos, with cyber psychos running rampant in the streets. Finally, in 2009, things grew so bad that the megacorporations had to act. A task force led by Arasaka moved professional troops and gear into the Night City, and they would systematically destroy the Mafia over a 3-year period. The corporations would put their own candidate in office as mayor, and corporate forces would be deputized and allowed free reign within city limits. These measures were extreme, but they worked, slowly pushing crime back down to manageable levels. Meanwhile, a second corporate war would break out between giants Sov Oil and Petrochem. They came to blows over oil fields in the South China Sea, but almost immediately resorted to killing each other rather than even trying to talk. At the same time, the US made a move against the Russians in a conflict known as the Orbital War. The US attempted to bring down a Soviet weapons platform, but the EEC intervened on the side of Russia, using the mass driver outside Tycho Colony to drop an asteroid on Colorado Springs, completely destroying the city and forcing the Americans into a peace agreement. The US would try one more time to regain their old status as a world power by taking over the construction of the Crystal Palace in 2009. But the European Space Agency discovered the plot, and the EEC used the Tycho mass driver again to drop another asteroid off the coast of DC as a warning. This effectively ended American hegemony internationally, and the Crystal Palace was completed in the year 2011. The world was beginning to enter a new status quo, one of conflict, global hardship, and corrupt corporations that had wormed their way into governments. But it was also a status quo of advancing technology and changing social norms. Netwatch was officially formed in 2013, an international organization dedicated to policing and protecting the net. Programs continued to become more advanced, and the first true AI was born that same year. The Third Corporate War would break out in 2016 as more financial corruption came to light. The Rothstein Fund and a group of private investors known as Merrill, Asugaga, like I said, bad with names, and Finch, or MA and F, ran into conflict as law enforcement began to unravel a complex Ponzi scheme that was set up by MA and F. This conflict was unique in that much of it took place on the net rather than in the meat world, though plenty of physical damage was still accrued. Water shortages started to become commonplace, with water riots breaking out in the world's more arid countries. The Galileo cylinder, an enormous habitable space station in orbit, was completed in 2017, and another one, named Paradise Station, was completed in 2018. NASA and the ESA set their sights on Mars and other bodies in the solar system, dispatching a manned mission to Jupiter. Human cloning became viable, and BioWare, the organic equivalent to cyberware, modifications to the body made with gene editing rather than machinery, became readily available. The nomads had grown ever since the collapse, more and more people displaced as instability spread. Many people looked down on them as little more than thieves and drifters, strangers to be feared and cautious towards. But the nomads filled an important role, helping to maintain trade and supply routes as disorder spread across the globe. It was nomad ships that transported goods across the Atlantic, and it was nomad teams who were contracted by corporations for large construction projects, including at Night City. In 2017, the nomads had grown large enough and developed enough of their own internal structure that they founded the 7 nomad nations. These nations were made of the largest, most well-organized of the nomad clans. They still existed as separate entities, but in general, they agreed to work together for the common welfare of all nomads, convening councils when major decisions need to be made, and meeting in large gatherings multiple times a year around the country. The next few years passed without major incident. Colonies were set up on Mars, but things would begin to shake up again in 2021 when a European aquacorp called Sino attempted to acquire a bankrupt rival known as IHAG. A third company, known as OTEC, also moved in to grab what was left of IHAG, and OTEC hired another company, Militech, a security firm, to fight for them. In response, Sino hired Arasaka, and this was the start of the Fourth Corporate War. The war would become violent by the beginning of 2022, with Militech and Arasaka striking against each other across the world. Sino and OTEC even signed peace accords, but by then it had gotten so out of hand that Militech and Arasaka just kept on fighting. The conflict was made worse by corruption on the net. Raish Bartmoss, potentially the greatest netrunner to ever live, had installed Dead Man's Code into the architecture of the net, and that code was released when he was killed in a corporate raid in the beginning of 2022. Over 75% of the net was corrupted by the end of that year. Militech and Arasaka fought each other with everything they had, using mass drivers, virus bombs, and more to bring each other low. The globe groaned under the conflict, with many nations finally having enough and threatening to nationalize Militech or Arasaka assets within their borders. Things finally got so bad that this had to happen, with Texas, California, and the EEC nationalizing both companies' holdings within their borders. The war finally ended at the end of 2023 when a small strike team led by the infamous rocker boy, Johnny Silverhand, detonated a nuclear device inside Arasaka Tower in Night City. Night City was destroyed in the attack. Much of downtown turned into a radioactive crater. Pockets of fighting would remain after this, but for the most part, With both companies severely weakened and the world horrified by the detonation of a nuclear device, the conflict would begin winding down, coming to a complete end by the year 2025. President Elizabeth Kress, the USA, promised to repair the damage done to Night City and to restore the country under a new banner of unity. She reorganized the US government into the New United States, or NUSA for short. Kress had declared a state of emergency during the Fourth Corporate War, and the country was a functional dictatorship. It would remain that way for decades, controlling all of the land east of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi was the Pacific Confederation, a loose union that was made up of many of the free states: Northern California, British Columbia, Oregon, Washington, Idaho. A new period of world history began, known as the Time of the Red. Dust particles and other debris from the Fourth Corporate War would stain the sky red for 2 years, and red sunrises and sunsets can still be seen sometimes. The world was broken, with every power on Earth taking concessions. Megacorporations were shattered, and local businesses began to become relevant again, oftentimes selling off stolen or abandoned corporate merchandise. An event known as the Diaspora began in 2026, millions of people setting out to reclaim wrecked and ruined cities that had been abandoned since the collapse. This included Night City, which had the outskirts resettled in the year 2030. The city had never been fully abandoned, with scrappy gangs of survivors holding on as best they could in the ruins, and a local movement of repair began. President Kress had promised to restore Night City, but in truth, she meant to let it languish, a wound in the Pacific Confederation that would eventually bleed it dry. So, the locals took things into their own hands, began to piece things back together on their own, calling in whatever favors they had with corporations, with gangs. Night Corp continued to work to restore the city to its former glory, shifting much of the ruined fill out of the downtown area. Local city nets began to be established across the world in reclaimed cities. These were local intranets that were only connected to one another through tightly controlled and limited means. Netwatch did its best to oversee the construction of this new net, trying to safeguard it against rogue AI. Things slowly began to stitch themselves back together. Factories went back online, and technology began to advance again. New corporations arose from the ashes of the old, beginning to stake their claim in the new power structure of the world. Netwatch would engage in a 3-year battle to reclaim the old net, starting in 2035, doing their best to clear out the Rabbids and other programs that had corrupted it. This would ultimately prove futile, and Netwatch would be forced to close down all nodes leading into the old net. Populations began to surge again, necessitating the construction of the first mega buildings, self-contained arcologies that could hold tens of thousands. The next several decades would be one of continued progress, with new tech beginning to develop and cities spreading again across the globe. Night City would continue its recovery, helped by corporations such as Arasaka, Kang Tao, Night Corp, and others. Despite this, though, decades of environmental abuse and catastrophe had taken their toll, and overall, the trend was still a downward slope. Superstorms ravaged the globe, forcing entire regions, such as the island of Haiti in 2062, to be abandoned. Desertification continued unabated, with vast regions turning arid. The ice dropped off the face of Antarctica, and the first human settlement was constructed there in 2067. Animal life died off en masse, with real animals becoming more and more scarce. The last wild shark finally died in 2067, and an unstoppable brush fire exterminated all but a single koala in Australia during 2068. The long reign of President Kress would finally end in 2069, after free elections were at long last restored to the new USA. President Rosalind Myers, former CEO of Militech, would replace Kress, and the new president would almost immediately launch a campaign to re-annex the Free States and the Pacific Confederation. This conflict would become known as the Unification War, or the Metal Wars, because of how many tanks were used during the conflict. The New USA's campaign was vicious, picking up as time sped into the year 2070. Sacramento would be carpet-bombed into a ruin, and Night City would fall under siege. The Soviet Union would send weapons and aid to help the defenders, and Night City would manage to hold out against Militech, supplied New USA forces for months. Finally, Lucius Rhyme, a member of the city council, reached out to his Arasaka contacts appealing for aid, and Arasaka responded, sending a supercarrier to dock off the coast of Night City within days. This put President Myers on the back foot, as she knew that despite the recovery, the New USA was not yet capable of a prolonged conflict against the likes of a company like Arasaka. Their forces withdrew, and reluctantly signed the Treaty of Unification with the Pacifica Confederation. Night City became a free international city, a harbor for trade routes into the Pacifica Confederation and between Northern and Southern California. Councilman Rhine was elected mayor, and the New USA military retreated to lick its wounds. And that pretty much brings us up to the present time of 2077. There are a couple minor things that take place in the years after the end of the Unification War, but it's not really too crazy, and this video is getting pretty meaty already. Sometime soon, I'll do videos getting more into detail about what went down in the separate regions of the world, like Europe, Asia, America, Africa. I'll also get into detail more about who some of the important folks in the world are, some of the backstories to these mega corporations, types of cybernetics, and more. But for now, I think I've jabbered on long enough. I'll let you guys go. Take care of yourselves out there. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe for future content. And may the Force break your chains.